Bennett University has raised the bar on bridging the gap between academia and industry yet again. Bennett University, which was established in 2016, not only boasts of state-of-the-art facilities, but is also committed to provide its students global exposure with top-of-the-line industry and thought leaders. Bennett University, the higher education initiative from the Times Group, recently conducted a stimulating panel discussion on the potential of India's path to economic growth, which saw participation by none other than Professor Michael Spence, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001. Sharing his views with the panel and the enthusiastic students, Spence lauded India's economic growth as well as thrust on building a strong digital economy and finance architecture in the world.
At your per capita income, probably the potential growth on a sustainable basis in the old days would have been 7 or 8%. And I don't see any reason why India can't grow at 7% on a sustained basis. By the time you have a per capita income, in a decade or two, 14,000, your potential growth is not going to be 7% anymore.
The panel, which also included Professor Roninton Medhora, chairman of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and Professor Rob Johnson, president of INET, was moderated by Ajay Sharma, senior editor ET Now. Bennett University Chancellor and the Times Group MD Vineet Jain also attended this distinguished event for the young scholars at Bennett University. The deep conversation, which touched upon new technology and sustainability, also included lessons for life on humility and smart thinking, something which certainly made the event a memorable one for everyone, especially the young minds at Bennett University.
First of all, thank you very much, Bennett University, for hosting ET Now. And it's such an honor to be with such of the brightest minds globally to talk about where the world is going from the economic perspective and also where are the opportunities for India. And thank you very much, sir, for choosing ET Now to really conduct this program. We are doing it on a daily basis on the channel, but today among so many young minds, feels like going back to college. Are you seeing economic models of countries, their economic models going massive transformation or changes? What turbulence are you referring to?
What do I mean by turbulence? Maybe the simplest way to describe it is, suppose you're in business operating in a multinational environment, and you ask yourself, why is now different from before? The answer is, you're under great pressure by supply chains. By the way, this is a huge opportunity for a whole range of countries. There's a whole bunch of concentrated manufacturing in China that's not going to be there in the near future. And the reason is that, for those of you who studied finance, when you have risk, you diversify so that you don't get cut off by having a single source. This diversification process is at some level rational, but at another level it's very expensive. So when I look at the growth patterns, especially in the developed countries, basically what we've done is shift from a kind of demand-constrained pattern to a supply-constrained pattern, where the supply constraints are really fairly severe and binding. So it's a very different world. Let me just take one other step. One of the consequences. We lived in a world for 30 or 40 years, which essentially was a deflationary environment. By that I mean, we had no sign of serious problem with inflation. We had massive increases in productive introduced into the global economy. So it doesn't matter what happened to the demand side, the supply side kept up. And we have a generation and a half of people in the financial markets, in business and so on, who have never lived in an environment where inflation was a pressure. Then we come out of the pandemic.
And now all of a sudden we have inflation. Why? Because we came out of the pandemic with healthy demand and healthy balance sheets. Demand surged and the supply side couldn't keep up. And the central bank said, well, the supply side disruptions are temporary and pandemic related. Well, that just turned out to be wrong. Right? And so they got a late start, raised the interest rates very high, and so on. So this is a world that has characteristics and experiences that we haven't felt for at least 3 decades. That's what I mean by regime change and disruption.
Are you also of the view that the disinflationary environment which the world has seen for many decades, and it got disrupted by COVID, and then inflation shot up, may be here to stay, it may be prolonged? Because if you look at the commentary coming out of some of the big central bankers across the world, and our own central banker too, they have not, even if the inflation numbers have tipped off, they are not giving any messaging that the rates are going down low anytime soon. They are cautious, starting from Federal Reserve too. So does it mean businesses, economies, individual investors, financial markets should not take it for granted that the inflation monster is fully under control and the rates will start heading lower?
Yeah, the straight answer is yes. So, I think humility requires us to admit that we don't really know for sure. But the way you put it is right. To take it for granted that we're going back to where we were before the pandemic hit us would be crazy, right? Remember, after the great financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, we had a decade in which we had zero nominal interest rates, negative real interest rates, huge injections of liquidity by central bank balance sheet expansion, purchasing bonds essentially, and no inflation. In fact, inflation below targets. So when I'm having this conversation with people in the financial sector, the business sector, I say, so do you think we're going to go back so that we could have that kind of policy environment and no sign of inflation? And usually that causes people to kind of pause and at least ask the question you just asked. So my personal view, and I admit this is a matter of uncertainty, is when the inflation fight is over and inflation's under control, we will have higher interest rates, real interest rates, higher costs of capital, and a very different world than we had before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Professor Spence, now that we have laid the ground for the economic environment we are operating in globally, not only in India, let's shift focus in a subject which you have done vast amount of work towards, and I'm sure a lot of students here would be very interested in. Role of technology in an economy. There is a reason why the current government has gone so whole hog in technology adoption and the infrastructure creation in tech space, which you also alluded to. But many economies, China has been an early adopter, Taiwan has been an early adopter of technology. Role of technology in growth, and then we come to artificial intelligence, how that is a disruptor. But you've seen economies, models of economic growth across the world. How do you rate the role of technology? How meaningful can it be?
This is a question that I think all three of us could comment on, and both Rob and Rohinton have had deep thinking about this. At some very abstract level, technology is the driver of growth, right? If you look at the growth pattern since when growth started, since the Industrial Revolution, it's driven almost entirely by science and technology breakthroughs and then their application with a lag in the economy. So at that very general level, I don't think this is different. What I think feels different to me right now is two things. One, the accelerated pace with which we are being handed the tools I referred to before.
Yes.
And they're not only powerful tools, but let's take Gen AI, right? Gen AI is the first artificial intelligence that has domain switching capability, right? You can talk to it, you can ask it to do computer code, you can talk to it about the Italian Renaissance, you can do it, and you don't have to tell it what the subject is, it knows, right? That's never happened before. All previous generations of AI had the characteristic that they worked fine in a well-defined domain, like recognizing images or something, translating a particular language. But if you switch domain on it, they're lost. And the second thing is it's accessible. ChatGPT had 100 million users in 2 months after it was sprung on us a little more than a year ago. That just never happened before either.
Let me also weave in Professor Medura about it, because you have, Professor Medura, you have worked a lot in the area of governance. And when we talk about, AI disrupting information and the dissemination of information becomes very asymmetrical,
the role of governance, especially companies who are aiming to be seen as per global standards. What are the things in your mind would be required to be done by the Indian business ecosystem to raise their governance standard in this type of a disruptive environment we are operating in?
So, Michael made a number of points, all of which are valid and I agree with. And so your question is a logical next step. I'd say one or two things about the world we live in. One is that although technology keeps driving it, the nature of the driver changes. And a lot more of wealth creation and the embodiment of wealth is now in what we call intangibles and intellectual property. And the second is that since intellectual property tends to be proprietary, there are distributional consequences, magnitudes different from what happened after the first industrial revolution, for example. One small factoid that I always use is if you look at the S&P 500, a generation ago, something like 1/6 of the value of the firms in it was in intangibles and 5/6 intangibles. Today, it's the complete reverse. And so the source of wealth is now locked up in this thing called intangibles. The smaller the firm, given the nature of this technology, the less, it's not as if you don't have access to new technology, but it costs more and you're simply renting it from someone else. And so that goes to the nub of your question in some ways, Ajay, which is that we need not only governance for the reasons Mike said, which is to regulate the quality of the information that, as you were saying, you deal with, but we also have to deal with the distributional consequences. And so I think for a small or medium Indian firm to buy into this, there's sort of 2 or 3 channels. One is to be part of the vast ecosystem that is part of the supply chain for the growth of AI, if you will. You will never own all of the IP, but you can at least share in some of the consequences by having contributed to the growth of IP. The second is to be part of the race to the top and not the race to the bottom. Now, it's unfair to ask any single firm, if there's a profit opportunity out there, to sort of rise above it and say, we only do high quality stuff, we don't deal in crap, we only deal with good information. But we know that there's money to be made from bad information. This is why we need a level playing field. And there's actually in our society only one entity that can create that level playing field, and that's government. So I think national governments have to rise up to the challenge to purify the information source, but we also need global governance. I think in some ways and this is what Mike was alluding to when he said, the systems, the architecture we have currently was built 60, 70 years ago when the kinds of issues we face today, be it climate or be it AI, simply didn't exist. So it's not like they did something wrong, they didn't have the mapping for it. And so unless we have, and I've argued for this, the global equivalent of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we need something similar for new technologies. From that filters a series of national and local actions which permit us of the purification of the system and the improvement of the system so that it is seen to be good, it is seen to be fair and equitable, and then you create that virtuous cycle in which more and more firms buy.
Is favorable demographics the bigger ingredient of high growth, or other factors to play a role too? And when you say that we are hitting the speed breaker, what do you really mean by that?
So demographics is favorable provided the employment engines are running fast enough. Okay, so that's a conditional, but it's important. Demographics and a large supply of young people when the employment engines aren't working is pretty much the opposite. So let me talk about the speed limit. I do know a little bit about the demographics here. This is a young country. I'll assume that in various sectors, the dynamics continues. At your per capita income, probably the potential growth on a sustainable basis in the old days would have been 7 or 8%. It's a tougher international environment, so I would bring that down a little bit. And I don't see any reason why India can't grow at something on the order of 7% on a sustained basis, right? That, there are a lot of conditionals in there, barring huge shocks that adversely affect everybody globally. By the time you have a per capita income, in a decade or two of, let's call it 14,000, your potential growth is not going to be 7% anymore, right? So that's kind of where that comes from.
Right. Okay, so that was a quick take on the environment we are operating and India's role. We have got a bunch of questions from faculty and students also. So why don't we get it a little more interactive? Can we have some mics out there? Okay, I have a question coming in from Dr. Kanika Agarwal, who's a faculty, which is sounding very interesting. Professor Rob, just look at it. If there's a trade-off between economic growth and development, especially looking at the scenario in emerging economies, she asks, which are now developing increasingly, how uncertain can it get in this precarious world? Dr. Kanika, are you around? Oh, there she is. Who'd like to take it? Professor Rob, would you like to take this one?
How uncertain can it get? I think we're already pretty far into the fog. And the question, I used that parable of Jampolsky's book, Love is Letting Go of Fear. When people are afraid, they can't see what's right in front of them. When people are determined and faithful that, in particularly government or other societies or other groups will be their partners, then they deploy their energies in a constructive way. I think right now the military conflicts in the Middle East, Ukraine, and perhaps on the horizon related to Taiwan, China, and the United States will continue to breed caution. And I think that, as Mike and Rohinton explored, we will have to demystify, particularly AI and technology, in a way where people who have watched innovation foster tremendous concentration of wealth and left a lot of people behind will not be the modus operandi in the next phase. To give you just a quick example in the United States. There's recent studies came out of the Economic Policy Institute that in the United States, more than 80% of people are worse off than they were in 1985. And up roughly 3% of the population has skyrocketed. Integrate that with the role of money in politics in America, and the distrust of both parties is overpowering. So I think there's something to do with ethical governance, and there's something to do with regaining trust, to have everybody take off their mooring lines and head out to sea for the transformations that we need to see.
Let's have one last question. Yeah? Okay, one is Mukul Gupta. Who's Mukul Gupta? Okay, why don't you start with it?
So let me be specific. How about the very, not a cryptocurrency, but a concept which was brought by Satoshi Nakamoto right after 2008 houses crisis, when US pensioners fund were brought to these things, where he brought the concept of honest money. And then this particular paper, which is considered as 90% law, 9% finance, and 1% technology, which is we refer as Bitcoin paper, and where there's a vision of an alternate currency to this entire kind of a paradigm, with its coin issuance going on to another century. How about that particular alternate in continuation to this particular discussion? Thank you.
Professor Spence, would you like to take that?
So I'm going to be rude. A cryptocurrency is not a currency. Because a currency is a store of value as well as a medium of exchange. And if its value changes by a factor of 20 or 30% in a week, it's hard to believe it's a store of value. So it's only a currency for people who want to hide in the dark net or something like that. I want to make two other points. One, this is different from blockchain. Blockchain is a set of technologies that have enormously important, applications in supply chains and elsewhere. And probably the central banks of the world will use it in their interbank transactions. So, because it's secure, it's traceable, and so on. And we have had incidents of people stealing money from, central banks. So it's not a trivial issue. But what we are going to have is central bank digital currencies. And they're completely different. They're fiat. They're like regular currencies because the central bank controls it. And we will get them as soon as they are able to solve extreme data security challenges associated with that. You can't have a central bank digital currency that you can hack into. It's just not possible. So then why are we going to have central bank digital currencies? Because the whole economy and the whole financial system is going digital, so the currency has to go with it. But I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but crypto is an asset class that lots of people are interested in. I don't happen to be one of them, but I mean, that doesn't mean it's not interesting. Maybe it's an alternative to gold. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure it's not an important part of the notion that we will have an economy running on a currency that's entirely DeFi, meaning decentralized, seems to me just not going to happen.
Professor Medor, would you like to add something on that?
Let me just add, actually agree with everything Mike said, but let me add one point on CBDCs, which is not only do they face the question of data security the way you mentioned, which is hacking, but I also think that by fusing payment systems with normal functions of currency, there's a tremendous question of privacy and tracking that comes up. And back to my point of governance is in Canada recently, the Bank of Canada, our central bank, did a survey on whether Canada should introduce a CBDC. And the number one concern was privacy. And so something as technical as currency issue is now caught up with questions of privacy and therefore of human rights and what kind of relationship should the citizen have with government and what's the trade-off between security and ease of doing commerce. It's all becoming wrapped up. And I don't think economists are the right people to be thinking about this solely. And so back to your point about, should governments and businesses be collaborating? Well, in CBDCs, you cannot do it without civil society having bought into the concept.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, please, of course.
This is absolutely right. A very important point that you're making. On the other hand, we're going to have digital transactions, right? With or without a central bank digital currency. So take China. Almost the entire consumer side of that economy is in mobile payment systems. India is moving rapidly in the same direction. That data resides in two companies called Ant Financial and Tencent, right? And so at some level, the data is there, right? And so we're thinking through this question. Some people don't, think it's fine for Ant Financial to have half the consumer data, transactions data for the Chinese economy, but they don't want the government to have it? I mean, I'm just raising questions, right?
And that's why India is working towards a data protection law and bill so that India's data can remain in our country. Thank you very much, Shainet, for bringing Professor Spence to Bennett University. Thank you very much for attending this. And the brightest mind in the area of finance talking about very relevant issues. Let's have a big round of applause for all our panelists there.